Empowering Voices continues our series on race and Christianity in the pulpit. Our guest today is the senior pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ, the Reverend Dr. EVOtisMoss III. Welcome back to Empowering Voices.
Thank you. It's always good to be back.
We're at a critical state today in May of 2012 for the United States of America, where racism continues to be a prevalent, critical issue. And within the context of the church, you've been, may I say, a Christian since you were, perhaps your mother has carried you
Absolutely.
in your womb, because your father has been a senior pastor all of his adult life. And you've been a pastor in the pastorate for 15 years of your adult life. Would you speak to, first of all, what is the definition of race and inclusion in the United States?
Well, in the United States, race simply is socially constructed, an idea that puts one group in power and another group is disempowered by biological determinism. Racism is being able to act upon that type of power. And so in the U.S., we define people by race, not by culture. Whereas a person of African descent, my culture is connected to Africa. But within the United States, we define someone's race by their color, which may not have anything to do with their culture.
And we hear also in the public square, within the context of race and racism, the word exclusion. What exactly does that mean?
Well, as a result of the history of the United States, we have had exclusionary practices, legal practices that have excluded people of color. The idea of race comes about in the mid-1700s, and specifically to make sure that people who were escaped slaves and who had skills would not be able to usurp those who were immigrants coming from Europe. And so we defined people as being subhuman, certain characteristics, and then put laws in place to support this idea. Now, it's rooted in economics, that the idea of racism and race is economically devised. And then it's politically supported, and then finally, as my father says, then there's theological acceptance of this. And so it starts with economics. I can make money off of creating a group of people who are slaves, then politics, creating a law to say, let's support this. And then theology comes behind all of that to say that God has ordained this to support a system. And so exclusion begins in the United States when the Africans first arrived here in the 1600s, and it continues today, but it moves in different phases. You have the antebellum period, the Reconstruction period, which is the development of the Jim Crow laws. Then after that, you move into what we call the Civil Rights or Freedom Movement period with the creation of the Voting Rights Bill and Voting Rights Act. And then we go from the post-Civil Rights period where you move to an integration mode where you also have exclusionary practices in housing and education, which are vestiges of what happened during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s.
And within the context, as your father has spoken to, and you are now teasing that out for us, that theology and racism has been lifted up, if you will, as an economic practice. Let's talk about how that impacts the church. Using the quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, the 11 o'clock hour is the most segregated hour for the United States of America. Even though the second greatest biblical scripture is love thy neighbor as thyself.
Right,
Would you speak to that?
Sure. The religion in America has been a religion of race, or a racialized religion, where we have seen different people categorized as subhuman or second class. The other thing that is very interesting in the United States is the idea of inclusion is only lifted up if it is framed from a European perspective. So people will make the statement that the church is segregated and we all just need to get along and we all serve the same God. We do in many ways, but there are some people who serve a God that is racist, or I shouldn't even say a God is racist, but serves, has a theology that is racialized. And one of the unique things is, I always raise the question that if we really want to create this kind of multicultural faith, then we have to begin to see the biblical narrative from an African-centered view, where we see the people in the Bible as people who are deeply connected to Africa, not in the current construct out of the Berlin Conference, but in the construct of the ancient period, or as Kane Hope Felder would call, the Afro-Asiatic endemic or African endemic community. And anytime you introduce biblical characters as being people of color and not from Sweden, there is a major pushback, because for several hundreds of years, we have seen Abraham and Isaac, we have seen David and Jeremiah and Amos and Jesus and Paul, all as people who are framed as someone who are Anglo and not as people from North Africa or Asia Minor. And when you introduce that, there is a real nervousness in America. You said, well, we want to talk, that doesn't matter. Well, if it doesn't matter, then let's go ahead and look at things this way. You could raise an entire generation of young people who would view not only Jesus, but other people in the Bible as being multicultural. And if that was the case, they would view people they saw on the street very differently. If they viewed Abraham as someone who was someone of dark complexion versus someone who had blonde hair, or if they viewed Moses as someone who was raised in Africa versus someone who looks like Charlton Heston. I think that those images, we've dealt with theology, but we haven't dealt with the images that we have put forth theologically, the icons that we have put forth. And I think it's very important for people of African descent, people of Asian descent, people who are Latino, to see themselves within the biblical narrative.
And within the context of the biblical narrative, the fact is, living today in the 21st century, the images are critical within the context of Christian theology because of social media, because of digital media. And so we face the fact that within individual pulpits across the United States, oftentimes we hear more African American preachers or preachers of color who speak to the sin of racism. First of all, do you think racism is a sin?
Absolutely. Anytime that you define someone out of the human family, that's what racism does. Racism does not view people as children of the Most High God, but simply defines them as in terms of biology. And it is a sin to utilize biological determinism to frame someone outside of the human family, to use that for your benefit, to press one group, to empower another group. It is a Babylonian perspective. That's what the Babylonians did when they took over those who were part of Israel and extracted several people from the story in Daniel of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They said to this group that you're an exception, you're not like the other people, and we're going to utilize your intellect to build the economic coffers of Babylon. And racism is not really something new. It's always had different forms. What's new is the way that America practiced racism, and it is a sin because we are specifically called to recognize that God is love, and how can you love God but yet hate your own brother? So that we are committing sin anytime that we are promoting hate of someone because of the way that they look, from their ethnic origin, from their gender, whatever it may be, we're promoting hate. And God is not a God of hate. God is a God of love.
When you preach about racism from your pulpit, and your pulpit is an interactive pulpit, if you will, that it is just not inside the four walls of Trinity United Church of Christ, you're seen globally. So what is the response from your congregation, be it here inside the four walls, and then the congregation who is virtual, as well as those persons who are not members of the church? Do you receive vitriol comments, if you will, from persons about you preaching about racism?
We have. We've had that experience here at Trinity where we've had people to say that, you know, what you are saying goes against what God is calling you to do. We've had people say that we're going to come and get you, and some things I cannot say, over the air here about calling out these sins of race and sins of class and sins of gender exclusion. And then but for the most part, most people are incredibly affirming of the fact that you're doing what Amos says, that you're to speak about these things and let justice roll like a mighty river, that you're doing what the great prophet has already stated, that we are to do justice, that we are to live and love mercy and to walk humbly with God, that we're doing what Jesus did in his inaugural sermon, or I like to say his mission statement for ministry. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach the good news to the poor, and that's what we're doing, because racism cripples a community to be fully productive. And wherever there is racism, you always have communities that are economically starved and that there's economic injustice. And so we are preaching the good news that God not only loves you, but God does not want you to live in a state of vulnerability or second-class citizenship. God did that with a woman at the well. God did that with a woman who had an issue of blood. God did that all throughout the book of Luke. You see this liberation narrative of God speaking to people who had been marginalized, who had been colonized, who had been oppressed, who had been repressed, and say, you are a part of God's family, and I love you the way that you are, and I want you to rise to a higher level. And Jesus was killed not because he gave some nice phrases, but because he was upsetting the balance of power that Rome had already put in place. He was a nonviolent, revolutionary man, and that's what we need to lift up in church, along with the personal responsibilities that we have. It's not either or, internal, external. It's always both. It's always personal and public.
And speaking of personal and public, a few years ago, Dr. James Cone, the father of Black theology, wrote a very profound piece about the religious cancer of racism. And within that essay, he talked about, and this is not verbatim, but he spoke to the fact that race criticism is as critical to the integrity of Christian theology as any critique in the modern world.
Absolutely. I would completely agree with what Dr. Cone says. One of the great luminaries of theology and bringing something new to the table, recognizing that theology within the academy was held hostage by not only issues of class, but also issues of race. That with all of the great perspectives of the social gospel, that it was not raising questions about racism, with the brilliance of a Reinhold Niebuhr not engaging the issues of race. And what is interesting, there is a PhD student who's working on studies of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he's making the claim that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was educated about this organic liberation theology by attending the Abyssinia Baptist Church, by spending time in Harlem, and hearing a different kind of theology that gave him the power to go back to Germany and oppose Nazi Germany and the extermination of the Jewish community and the widespread repression that was being put forth by Adolf Hitler. Is because of a liberation narrative, is because of a church that spoke prophetically, that was rooted deeply in the Old Testament prophets, to say that we have to do justice, we have to live mercy, and we have to walk humbly with our God.
What is your, I guess I could say, recommendation, or in your opportunity to teach and preach to other pastors who are pastors in the 21st century? We know for a fact that social scientists have revealed to us by the year 2024, and definitely by the year 2045, that the American Christian church will not be predominantly white, that it will be predominantly a church of color. And as we face this issue of racism, should racism be preached about in the pulpit? Should it be taught from a practical standpoint, along with Bible study classes. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think that the Bible is the greatest multicultural book that you ever come across. If we were to look at those biblical characters from today's vantage point, they would fit very comfortably into an Asian, Native American, Latino, and Black community and be able to walk around. You wouldn't know if they were Dominican, Haitian, if they were Puerto Rican. If you would have no idea based on how we view a race. Number one. Number two, I think it's critical for us to talk about the issue of racism. That's America's original sin. America was built on this idea of racism. Anyone to deny that doesn't know American history, that Americans' wealth was built on the backs of imported free labor. If America had to pay for that labor, America's growth would have been retarded tremendously for it to be, quote unquote, a world leader economically. The other thing is that it has to be taught in connection with the Bible, is that the Bible speaks of these issues of cultural clashes consistently. Moses married an Ethiopian, not that they were upset that he married a person of color, because they were all the same color, but someone of a different class, of a different culture. And so they viewed someone of Ethiopia that he went uptown, he went uptown to marry somebody who was well off. And so the issues of class were put there. And then when you look at Jesus spending time with Samaritans, here we go, issues of race again. They're not really like us. They don't have the same DNA that we have. Problem again. You have the story of Jephthah in the book of Judges, where Jephthah's mother was considered to be someone, in one translation, a prostitute. Other scholars say that she was probably forced into a relationship with Jephthah's father, who was a mighty warrior, Gilead. And so again, you have another issue of race, because Jephthah was considered to be biracial in many ways, and so therefore was rejected by his community. You also have Moses, who deals with the issues of rejection, again, because yes, he's raised in Pharaoh's household, but at the same time, he is not necessarily completely considered to be fully a part of that community. So you have these issues of rejection over and over and over and over again that are lifted up in the Bible, and we have to show that to help people understand that God is not in no way endorsing our man-made ideas that certain people have privilege and status and other people are to be second class.
And within the context of the reality of the man-made ideas of racism, and we take a critical look before we end this conversation at the fact that we have our first African-American president who is a devout Christian. But yet he and his family are almost, I'm going to use the term, almost forbidden to, it's dangerous in a sense, if you will, for them to attend a church, because if he attends a church, then that church is heavily politically scrutinized by the religious right.
Absolutely.
And because of his embodiment as a person of African descent, they are questioning, first of all, if he's an American, and also if he really is a Christian.
Right.
As the pastor of his former church, would you speak to the critical nature of what an awful sin it is? We keep speaking of this over and over, but just speak more about the first president, first African-American president of the United States is a Christian, but yet he cannot find, he's not politically allowed to have a church home.
Well, again, I think it goes to the issue of race. You have a president who comes out of a prophetic church tradition, a very powerful ministry, and at the same time, very normative in the black church on so many levels in terms of being able to speak out about these things. That's nothing unique to people who have grown up in the black church. The other thing that's very interesting to me is that Jimmy Carter, who taught Sunday school, he could go to church. Ronald Reagan, who never went to church. George Bush Sr., who was very quiet about his church. Bill Clinton, who comes out the Southern Baptist Church. Everyone is allowed to enter into their own particular tradition, even though those traditions today would be scrutinized in a very different way if President Obama was a part of those traditions. If he was a Southern Baptist, there would be heavy criticism on the left and some on the right. If he was a Catholic, there would be heavy criticism on the right and on the left about his position. And not allowing this family to even attend a church because they have utilized and eviscerated in many ways his ability to be able to worship freely because it's now a political tool instead of giving, just like Jimmy Carter had the opportunity. Reagan had the opportunity. He went to church about 3 or 4 times. I'm not quite sure how many. George Bush was very private about it. And Clinton, who went to a Methodist church while he was in, I think it was Foundry Methodist Church while he was in Washington. And from time to time went to Sunday school. But yet our president today can't go to church because we have created a political culture where we're looking for the exotic, unique, racialized rhetoric on the right to point to the fact that the president really isn't a Christian. And then on the left, there are people who are trying to say, well, we've got to find if this church is liberal enough for us to be able to support. It shouldn't matter. He should be able to worship with his family, pray with his children, and receive what God specifically has for him in his own personal life.
Our last question as we conclude this conversation. Within the context of the phrase, the intentional intersecting of media, race, racism, and Christianity in the pulpit. Moving forward for the 21st century church, what do we need to stop doing as Christians in our church so that we can live out the true meaning of love thy neighbor as thyself?
We need to stop listening to some of the foolishness on the television, on the radio. We need to begin to think for ourselves. We need to ask for forgiveness. We need to repent. We need to begin to enter into moments of prayer. We need to get back to the spiritual disciplines. And at the same time, we have to be able to communicate and speak out about the injustices that are happening in our community. But the church community, from moving into the future, we need to force our politicians and demand of our media agencies that they stop becoming a tool for a small corporate minority. That is what we must do in the future if we're going to have the democracy of the airways return back to the people.